Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Tim Horgan. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We're really pleased to be providing this opportunity to talk further about the US-China relationship, where it's headed, and really excited to have Ambassador Lavin here tonight to provide his insights into this. Before we get started, I just have a few things to remind you all of. First off, I want to thank the Southern New Hampshire University for being our mission partner and providing us such wonderful support. I also want to thank the John Bickford Foundation, as well as Charlie and Barbara Bickford for their support of tonight's event. We really appreciate all you do to help us continue these programs and bring international discussions to the state and now to the world. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization, and therefore we do not take any policy stances on issues, policies, candidates, etc. We are here to provide a platform for discussion, and we hope that you take the information you learn here tonight and formulate your own opinions about it. We really appreciate all of our wonderful members who support our organization and help to make these programs possible. If you are not yet a member, we would ask and love it if you would consider joining our membership. We have a number of opportunities for you to engage in our global community, and we hope that you will value the programs and the work that we do by becoming a member. With that, I will turn it over to Davis Farmer in order to introduce the ambassador. Hey, Davis.
Hi, Tim. Thanks. I want to echo Tim's comments and welcome everybody to this evening's presentation. And to encourage anybody who is not yet a member of the World Affairs Council in New Hampshire to consider joining. It's actually really inexpensive. Tonight, our guest speaker is Ambassador Frank Lavin. Ambassador Lavin has a career in public service that began in 1981 and included positions in the Reagan, the George H.W. Bush, and the George W. Bush administrations. His career culminated with a 4-year stint as ambassador to Singapore from 2001 to 2005, followed by 2 years as Undersecretary of Commerce for Trade. His time in Singapore was notable for having negotiated the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, and while at Commerce, he was the senior official for trade policy. Since 2010, Lavin has served as CEO of Export Now, an agency focused on helping U.S. companies export to the People's Republic. He is the author of several books on trade and serves as a trustee of the Asia Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Frank Lavin.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. Thank you, Davis, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Tim, for hosting us today. And I'm delighted to be able to spend some time with you today and have a conversation. I was just reflecting that before COVID hit, where we were all traveling a lot more, speaking a lot more, the very last talk I gave on China, that was 24 months ago, excuse me, was in New Hampshire. It was in Hanover because Matt Slaughter, the dean at Tuck, is an old friend from the George W. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors when I was Undersecretary of Commerce. And so he said, you got to come and talk to the students about China. And that was fun. I got to spend 2 days there and talk. And he had a secret weapon because our youngest is a Tuck graduate. So she could kick me in the ankles as well and say, you've got to come do this. So it's with a fond memory of my last New Hampshire sojourn in real life that now I get to do it digitally and say hi to everybody electronically. But I hope to get back when we're back to doing more traveling and have some more in-person conversations. But look, we were just chatting before we went live about the China conundrum, and we're kind of half joking that this is not going to be the last China discussion. And that's sort of the central point of my presentation today, is that to my mind, U.S.-China relations are the central foreign policy issue of our era, because China is the only major power that is still defining its international role. Every other major power is a stable power. China is an ascendant power. It's new to the international system, and what it seeks and what it's trying to do occasionally challenges the international system, or at least challenges the status quo. By the way, that's not to say there aren't other foreign policy challenges. The Mideast, Russian behavior, Iranian nuclear program, Cuban malevolence, North Korea, there are a lot of other problems, but these are rogue states or small powers that have the ability to cause harm, but they don't have the ability to change the international system or engage in a long-term challenge to the United States. And look, it's to my mind, it's very straightforward how we got here. China's enjoyed now about 4 decades of strong economic growth, and that has taken it out of poverty to middle income status. It's propelled it economically to the front ranks of nations. China is now the second largest economy in the world, and that economic growth translates into greater political aspirations and greater military budgets. So China has a voice and a reach in the world that it just didn't have a few decades ago, I should say. So that's my first point, that China is the issue we face today. My second point, to take on board to put this all in context, is China's history. That, again, different than all other major powers, China has never been part of an international system. All of the other major powers, the European powers, United States, and I would put even Japan in that mix, have all participated in an international system for decades, for generations, for centuries. China has been a standalone power without neighbors that it has enjoyed stable relationships with. In fact, I would say the lesson for China from international relations is very different than the lesson the United States has learned from international relations. So their lesson is this, that in history, there are only 2 scenarios. You are either stronger than your neighbor or you are weaker than your neighbor. And your peace, your security comes from being stronger than your neighbor. And if you are weaker than your neighbor, they will exploit you or invade you or colonize you or subjugate you. That's the way the world works. In other words, China has never been a part of a stable international system in which all countries participate, the one the United States is most familiar with. So I'd say for China, being more powerful than neighbors is a core security requirement, and strategic depth, geographical depth, becomes a security requirement as well. The United States has a very different experience. Our 2 most consequential successes in foreign affairs all came through leadership in an international system. One is the triumph of the Allies in World War II, and the second is the triumph of the West in the Cold War. And the United States prevailed through leading collaborative effort and keeping dozens of other like-minded countries in this kind of framework that allowed us eventually to win. United States would also say that security comes not through strength alone. Security comes through a stable international system in which all countries can participate with some degree of fairness and predictability. So all countries then have a vested interest in preserving the system. Right? So that idea of a stable international order is deeply ingrained in Western thought, United States foreign policy thought, not so ingrained in China. So at present, we've got a range of issues between our 2 countries. Trade and economic issues where I've spent much of my life, but also these geopolitical issues such as the security of Taiwan, South China Sea, regional cooperation, competition in Southeast Asia, human rights issues. So there are a range of issues. And I would say, unfortunately, we have a limited ability to solve or manage these issues. And I say it mainly because there seems to be very little in the way of trust or respect between the 2 countries. And most unfortunately, we seem to be at a moment where the domestic political payoff in each country is greater if that country is defiant. Meaning, it is very difficult for anybody in China to respond to U.S. requests or demands. They will pay a domestic political price if they do that. They'll look weak. They'll look as if they're giving in to a pushy adversary. They look as if they're not defending the national interest. So it is a real challenge for China to move the way we want them to move. Similarly, I would say it's almost impossible for the United States to show any flexibility towards China because the exact same reason that U.S. leader would look weak or not protecting U.S. interest. I thought it was striking when President Biden came into office, to give a current example. Not surprisingly, he was extraordinarily critical of Trump during the presidential campaign. And as he came in, there was some discussion about would he remove the tariffs on China that Trump imposed. Well, Biden hasn't spoken at length on this, but he sure hasn't removed those tariffs. And to my mind, it's just what I articulated, that he would subject himself to domestic political criticism if he were to do that. And there's no sense paying a price for that kind of relationship. Third point I'm making U.S.-China relations. China, this my personal opinion, China's political system amplifies the challenge. China's political system makes this all worse. It's moved and economically to market economics, largely, not completely, but largely to market economics, which is good. But politically, it's remained a Leninist system. So it's an odd combination. No other communist system adapted that twin approach toward government. In fact, the Soviet model became the model for all of Eastern Europe, for Cuba, for North Korea, for the African countries that were in the Soviet orbit, where it was a Marxist economy as well as a Leninist government. So China's moved away from that under Deng Xiaoping, and they've got this sort of split. But pay attention to that Leninism, because Leninism stipulates that the supreme value in government is cohesion. Your job, if you are a government official, your job is to support decisions. You cannot readily challenge or question policy. As a result of that, you tend to have overshoot. You tend to have overstep or overshoot or items of friction that, to my mind, don't help China. Let me give you an example that's gone on for 10 years. We've read in recent weeks about China buzzing the Taiwan air defense zone. Well, China for about 10 years has been buzzing and having overflights over Japanese administered islands, the Sakaku or Diaoyutai Islands, south of the main island group of Japan. What purpose does that serve China? How does that help China? I can tell you the impact in Japan. The impact in Japan is the same as if they were overflying the United States. The impact in Japan, that under Prime Minister Koizumi, Japan underwent the greatest single defense buildup in the modern era, because that's what you do if somebody's pushing you. You respond. In fact, Japan has a surface navy that is greater than the entire surface navy of non-US NATO combined, every single NATO country, ex the US combined. So Japan has invested a lot in that naval build out. Now, if you went back in time 10 years and you were advising Beijing, you'd say, wait a second, you're the ascendant power. Your economy is growing. Japan is the stagnant economy. Time is on your side. There's no need to buzz these guys. There's no need to poke them. And in fact, there's U.S. defense constraints and U.S. nationalism, and you get presidents like Trump saying, hey, Japan's not paying enough. So there's always budget pressure for the U.S. to draw down its forces. And Japan has some of those same pressures to draw down. So the best thing for you to do is not irritate Japan at all. And let there be sort of a natural decline in their defense capabilities, a natural decline in U.S.-Japan defense relationship. But China did not do that. China did the exact opposite. By provoking Japan, it re-energized Japan's defense capabilities, and it re-energized the U.S.-Japan defense relationship. So why in the world did they do that? We had another example just this year with the China-India border clash. India has never been an ally of the United States. India has always been a neutral power. And in fact, India, in the Cold War, India procured more defense material and more training from the Soviet Union than from the United States. They always had sort of more of a Moscow tilt than a Washington tilt. Now that's corrected post the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's engaged more with the United States. But if you were China, one of your golden rules would be we don't want a border clash with our neighbors. We're going to be neighbors forever. We don't want to energize these guys. We don't want to irritate these guys. So we don't want friction or ill will to turn hot, because we know that will electrify the whole country. And yet that's what happened. That's what happened. So you have weak management or over emboldened line commanders or whatever set of reasons, but it was, to my mind, an egregious miscalculation from China, and it redounded very much to China's detriment that they had this clash. So what did we get out of that? Well, that takes me to the fourth point. What does this mean for the United States? What's the best way of dealing with these challenges? I think it's long-term because of the size and economic weight of China. I don't think there's much direct potential for solving these or working these things out because of the nature of the relationship. So what can you do? My point is you need to enlarge the problem. You need to work with friends and allies in like-minded countries. Don't define the problem purely bilateral. In other words, if you've got a problem with China, don't necessarily go running to China. Go run elsewhere. Go run a lot of places. Now, I was critical of recent presidents. I want to give Obama and Trump and Biden credit for the Quad, reinvigorating the Quad, which is the consultative body of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. So now there's a consultative mechanism for the four friendly military powers of East Asia and South Asia to collaborate. It's not designed as an anti-China mechanism. It is not a treaty alliance, but it is very useful to have improved communications between these powers about how they can work better together. So that is a good step ahead in helping bolster the U.S. efforts to deflect whatever, if China gets some kind of temptation to do something unhelpful, we've got something at the ready. Similarly, the AUKUS treaty, which is Australia, UK, US, involving the sale of nuclear submarines to Australia, is another example of saying, sure, let's pull in friends like the UK into this arrangement as well. That is more of a formal military treaty. So enlarging the conversation, if you will, I think is a constructive way of deflecting China's worst instincts. In other words, a deterrent strategy or a dissuasion strategy of signaling to China that the cost of misadventure or the cost of miscalculation will be high. Now, my only complaint or suggestion in this area is I think the U.S. has done a reasonably good job on political military issues in following this advice. The U.S. has not done anything on the economic and trade issues from this advice. Meaning, if you are concerned about China's behavior in the economy and trade, which I certainly am, then what you should do is look for better relations with other nations in the region, in the Pacific region, which, by the way, share the exact same concerns, very, very similar to the political military concerns. They're not comfortable dealing with China. They don't view China as a good neighbor. They view the United States as a much better friend, much better partner, more rules-based behavior, just a better collaborative partner. And indeed, it was the United States that initiated what was to be the signature trade agreement for the region, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then the United States, having gotten the negotiations going, the United States pulled out of it. And there's no sign that we're going back into it. In the meantime, China has said that it wants to enter it. So we helped design the economic architecture for the region to help give the United States better reach and credibility and connectivity with friendly nations in the region. We put all that together, and then we went to sleep. or we pulled out. And China said, well, we'll step up. We're going to jump into. We're coming to jump into it. So we've got, to my mind, a weak point there. But we're unfortunately at a moment in the United States where the dominant political mood is against international trade, and it would require leadership from Washington to get that back on a firm footing. So I'm not optimistic about us being able to compete with China because there's no appetite in Washington for that competition. So that sums up my presentation, Tim. I'm very happy to take questions on the points I've raised or other points.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, for your remarks. We've gotten a lot of great questions coming in already, but I am going to take my role as moderator for an opportunity to get my question answered first.
Sure,
and it relates to what you were just talking about in terms of trade. One of the things that we hear is, China has, and I think this has changed in the recent past, but China's taken all these manufacturing jobs away from us. We need to bring those good paying jobs back to the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about the role that AI and technology has played in the role of the reduction of manufacturing here in the U.S., as well as do we want to compete with China for those types of jobs, or do we want to, and I'm showing my opinion here, but do we want to compete more with the Germanys of the world for these more advanced manufacturing types of jobs? Yeah. So I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, look, China's role in the international economy is a controversial one, and it plays into this sort of a populist theme that we get sometimes in America. I think the challenge the United States poses to the U.S. economy is vastly overstated. That in some respects there have been some jobs that have moved there. In some respects, it's also helped U.S. jobs as well. And I would say this: if it's 100% true that it's been a harmful impact, or if China didn't exist at all, I would still give the same economic advice to a U.S. president. I'd say you want an economy that's as efficient as possible, that is open as possible, that allows for competition, allows for growth, recognizing that no job and no industry lasts forever. And whether China exists or is not part of the picture at all, we know just what we were talking about in the last 10 years, how the U.S. auto industry's changed, how U.S. steel is being supplanted by polymers and miracle plastics, how U.S. energy is being transformed by alternative energy. So if we just took a look in the phone book in your town in New Hampshire today and said, these are all of the jobs in my community today, and you ask yourself 20 years from now, how many of these jobs are going to be there? Well, the realtor job won't be there. The bank teller job won't be there. The school teacher job will probably be there in some form, but it's not going to be the same job. So all of these jobs are subject to competition and to technology and just to societal transformation. And I think China's role in this is actually pretty small. So it's not primarily a China phenomenon that the steel intensity of U.S. cars is about 50% now of what it was 20 years ago, or the Ford Motor Company can make the exact same number of cars today with half the workforce that it had 20 years ago. That has a lot to do with technology and automation, right? There's nothing really to do with China. Indeed, we would say General Motors sells more Chevys in China than it sells in the United States. So China market helped keep General Motors alive when it was going through convulsions and downsizing in the United States. But look, there has been some migration. There's been some migration to Mexico, some migration to China. Even if the numbers aren't huge, it's very painful, right? But I'll tell you, this is not a trade point. This is an economic point. I'd say the best way of dealing with bad news is to create as much good news as possible. But if you go through life, whether it's an economic point or a trade point, don't try to litigate bad news. Don't try to sue or stop bad news. Meaning, I would say, what economic policies do we need to adopt in the United States to make it as easy as possible for businesses to grow and jobs to be created? And let's go down that path. And we would do that whether Mexico existed or didn't exist at all, or whether China was a trade partner and not a trade partner at all. So I'm saying I wouldn't design our policies around China or Mexico. But I'd say this: if you are concerned about trade fairness, then the free trade agreements are your best friend. At least you're going to have a level playing field with free trade partners that you're not going to have from China.
Okay, great. Davis has a question that's a little long here, so I won't pop it up on screen. But basically, he's wondering what the changing posture on big business in China is. What does it mean, particularly in the tech companies? And I would add now with property developers and Evergrande being such a mess these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. And by the way, we have some of these themes in the United States, but it's very interesting because it really came to the forefront this year. Enormous swing in government against tech. They punished Alibaba, then they forced Alibaba not to go ahead with its IPO for its financial arm, Ant Financial. They punished the ride-hailing service Didi and had the app stores take its app down. So they're unhappy with big tech, and there are several issues there. I think one issue that they're most sensitive about is these tech platforms and tech activities are so big and so pervasive. They're playing a kind of natural monopoly role that typically the government plays, right? By the way, we have some of these same sensitivities in the United States. Is Facebook just too big, or is Google just too big, or can they do things? Can they tilt news or tilt outcomes because they're so big? So some of these are very similar. But in the United States, at least we'll have an open debate or open argument and decide if we want to regulate these or do something about it. China came in, I think, very clumsily and to punish the tech sector. And I, to my mind, that's a mistake for China, that it's going to end up hurting that sector and hurting investment in that sector. And China had some real interesting innovations that were kind of some of which were better than what we see in the U.S., but they've really doused that. Evergrande is an example of a debt overhang, that a company expanded way too fast, way ahead of the market, took on way too much debt. And by the way, when I say way too much debt, when we say that at a personal level, it means like, you've got $1,000 a payment on your credit card and you hadn't been paying attention and it's due tomorrow and you gotta find it out. Look, this debt of Evergrande is $300 billion, billion with a B. So it's not somebody put $1,000 on their credit card. I mean, this is a systemic risk for the country. And look, they'll work through this. They'll work through it because there's enough good news in the Chinese economy. They can just sort of buy their way out of this problem. But what's striking to me is that this problem is representative of a system where there aren't the normal credit controls and policings, and especially local government debt is huge. So I think, people talk about the U.S. is going to have a reckoning at some point. Maybe we've got a lot of debt on our books as well. China, I think, is in a worse fiscal position, a lot of local debt and not a lot of accountability and not a lot of transparency. So look, here's my view. I want to tie all this into the broad discussion I'm giving about the nature of the moment. China at the moment presents a challenge to the United States and the international system, in part because they're on this upward trajectory, but in part because the insularity means they somewhat discount or aren't aware of the problems they have, and they overstate their good news. And this is typical in a dictatorship, I would say, that there's no opposition party having the conversation you and I are having about debt in China. There's nobody raising questions about military expenditure or military adventurism, and so you get mistakes made. And I think there's a window that's several decades long, during which China can easily overshoot or easily miscalculate, because I wouldn't quite call it arrogance, but there's enormous self-confidence in China that they have figured it out, that they have got the right combination of market economics and a totalitarian system, and that combination gives them extraordinary advantages. And the U.S. is a mess. The U.S. It's interesting when we talk to Chinese friends or Chinese leaders about the U.S. U.S. is a mess. U.S. has its debt problem. U.S. has messy politics. Democracy just gives you rent seeking and corruption. Economic growth is much, much lower than than China's. Afghanistan was a debacle. There's no national pride or purpose. It's a very divided society, race issues, class issues, and so forth. So the United States is not really capable of international leadership, and the United States' best days are behind it. China has really got its act together, and China is poised for growth and leadership in the region. And you will have very senior Chinese say this to you. The only reason the U.S. is critical of China is a sort of jealousy. It just sort of, you're just bitter because you had your chance and it's over, and now it's our moment in the sun, and you're just pissy about it. And I was on a debate with one guy, and he said, very, very well spoken. This is a mainland Chinese guy, Yale Law School guy. He's a very sharp guy, very comfortable in American and Western audiences. He said, United States is Tanya Harding. You guys are just trying to hit us in our knees. You're just trying to beat us because you can't win in a fair competition for the medal. So you gotta get your pals to come out with a crowbar or whatever, whack our knees to take us out of the competition. Now, whether he honestly believes that or that's just expedient for him to say, I think it does capture a viewpoint that you hear quite frequently in China.
Yeah, and the point about the local government debt and that there is this sort of debt bubble kind of brewing perhaps underneath the surface for China, I think is something that is really not well understood or talked about. So thank you for bringing that up. I did want to bring in, we had a question come in on Facebook, and in terms of responding to your comment about free trade, is it a good idea for the U.S. to rejoin the TPPA? What is the likelihood of this to happen?
Look, this is kind of a philosophical view. In my view, if you go back to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, make it as easy as possible for people to engage in enterprise. People have ideas, they have aspirations, whether they're making shoes or they're selling something or God knows what, but make it as easy as possible for good news to happen, and you're going to get more good news. And that is true domestically. We don't have any tariffs between our states. And I would say the more we can do that internationally, the better off we are. The lower our tariff barriers, the more prosperous the U.S. will be. It was striking to me that we had a president run for office, Trump, last time on sort of an anti-trade platform, saying trade has kind of hurt America. And he was criticizing NAFTA all through his presidency. Well, the U.S. economic numbers and employment numbers were literally the highest, the best they'd ever been in history. So we'd gone through about 20 or 30 years of trade liberalization with different free trade agreements with Australia and Israel and Singapore and Canada and Mexico, about 20 of these, and enormous benefit for the U.S. economy. And you could see it in all of the numbers that we have employment and GDP up and inflation down. And this guy's still railing about trade. That trade has somehow hurt us, the mess is over, and it's unfair, and people are cheating, and we've got to stop it. And unfortunately, I think that had a very damaging effect. But the question was, what should we do? The right thing to do is to reduce tariffs, work with like-minded countries that are rule-based, and sign more trade agreements. And yeah, I'd be very, very concerned about conceding East Asian economies to China. There is not one East Asian society, all of Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, not one country out there where kids wake up in the morning saying, I hope our country is closer to China. There's not one, because China is so much larger. And China, by these smaller guys, it's viewed as predatory. So nobody says, thank God they're more involved in our economy. In fact, every single one of them says, where's America? You guys are okay, right? And they all have a frame of reference from American sports and TV shows, and everybody's got a cousin who went to USC or someplace. So, there's a real affinity for Americans. But if we say we're taking a powder, we're not for it, then they say, look, we've got no choice but to reach some kind of accommodation for China, because China is not always very pleasant about it, and they're here forever. So we can't rebuff them. We've got to calibrate our foreign policy in some kind of way that placates them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see these countries try and hedge between the two powers and figuring out what is going to be best for them long term. And certainly we've seen a lot of changes in our foreign policy over the past few years, but also some similarities. And that brings to a point that you touched on a little bit earlier. But where do we stand in the Trump phase one trade deal? Where are we? Where is there going to be a phase two? What do you expect for the future of U.S. trade?
China is not going to meet its commitments on phase one. I'd be quite surprised if they did. Back to my earlier point, if you want to lose your job in China, give Trump what he wants. I mean, the last thing you want to do from the Chinese point of view is to allow phase one to be successful. Because the one thing the United States is not going to say is, well, thank you. That's the two words you're never going to get from the United States. The two words you're going to get from the United States is more, please. Right? If we threaten you or raise tariffs or did something to you that was unpleasant and you respond and give us what we want, all you've done is train us to do it again. So look, the Chinese know all this. I mean, this is not secret. This is just game theory, right? So the Chinese say, if I were in Beijing, I think I would have done what they did. What do we have to say to get Trump out of the room? And then let's make sure we come in below what he's claiming, we signed up for, we agreed to. Let's make sure it's not viewed as a success. So, and let's make sure there's a lot of friction and minimalism throughout this whole process so that whatever happens in Washington, nobody in Washington says, let's do this again. But also, I just want to note, this whole approach violates the point I articulated in my presentation, that if you've got a real problem with China's military behavior, don't invest a lot of time trying to get China to change it. Invest time working with neighbors. I'd say the same thing with economic trade. If you got problems with China's economic and trade policy, pretty easy to do. Why don't you find like-minded countries and reduce tariffs with them? So what is the functional equivalent to raising tariffs on Chinese goods would be lowering it on other trading partners in China. And by the way, that wouldn't hurt the US economy. I mean, the odd thing about raising tariffs is it's symmetrical pain, it's symmetrical dislocation. So if you're talking to anybody in general about, I really wanted to stick to I really don't like my supermarket in my hometown. So what I'm going to do is put a extra tax on that supermarket. Yeah, no question, you're hurting them. By the way, you're hurting every single customer of that supermarket as well. So I wouldn't do that. What I would do is say, why don't you get another supermarket in that town? And why don't you encourage other people to shop at this new supermarket, right? So to work with other people rather than aiming all your artillery fire at China. So I think, look, the signal Trump sent to them was, it's not about trade necessarily. It's not even about China necessarily. It's about pugnacity. I want to throw a punch and I want to look like the tough guy. So he threw a punch and he looked like the tough guy. By the way, I have to say, sounds a little juvenile perhaps, but I kind of like that part of it because China does throw its weight around and, get a punch every once in a while, maybe not a bad idea. Now, was it productive? Did it solve the problem? Probably not. And what's the tell on this tactically? What's the tell? I think in any management construct, if you say, I got a problem with you and I'm going to attach some cost to your behavior, and I've got a choice of whether I do this publicly or privately. I tell you this, if I'm doing it publicly, that's a tell. That's a tell that this is posturing, that this is a domestic political issue, and it makes it more difficult for you to actually do what I want. If I got a problem with your behavior and I attach a cost to it, but I do it privately, I pull you aside and say, listen, I've told you that you're coming in late, and so I have to dock your pay or whatever, but I'm doing that privately. I'm at least affording you some dignity and giving you a chance to correct. If I do it publicly, the goal here is clearly just to insult you, to stigmatize you, and I'm kind of indifferent to what happens to you. What I'm really interested in is just kicking the tar out of you. So that Trump got what he wanted. Trump got what he wanted, which was public belligerence toward China. And predictably, he set up a dynamic where it was basically impossible for anybody in China to respond the way he wanted them to respond. So he's not going to get what he wants out of phase one, and he's got to recalcitrant China, and the relationship deteriorated a bit. So, but I don't think that's a surprise to anybody in Trump's camp. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in Beijing.
Okay, so we've gotten a number of questions about Taiwan. So I'll sort of package them together. But speaking of Taiwan, should the U.S. continue the policy of strategic ambiguity towards our security guarantee, as well as there was another question about how strong is our commitment to the country, to Taiwan?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I did my graduate work in Taiwan. I lived there for a year. My first job in the executive branch was with our liaison office in Taipei, American Institute in Taiwan. So I've got a special feeling toward Taiwan. I think strategic ambiguity is helpful in this sense. If you delineate clearly what will provoke a military response, the concern with that kind of lack of ambiguity is you're encouraging adversaries to go right up to that line, right? You're forsaking everything south of that line. But ambiguity is a more potent weapon because you say, we don't know. We don't know what we'll do. We don't know when we'll do it. But the two components of deterrence are capability and credibility. They know, they have to know that we can do it. We can inflict a price on their behavior. They know that. We've got the hardware to do it. That's not the question. The question is credibility. Do they think the United States is going to stand up on this issue or respond? And look, with Obama, they said your points aren't credible. That, you know, China said we won't militarize South China Sea, and they did it. And Obama said, I wish you hadn't done it. You broke your word. And they said, no kidding. I mean, Andy Warhol once said, art is whatever you can get away with. You could also say foreign policy is whatever you can get away with. And you look, from Beijing's point of view, they got away with it. They said, we build out on these islands of South China Sea. The United States got angry and unhappy. We'll take that deal. That's okay with us. You guys were never friends anyhow. And now we've got a little more power projection. By the way, but to my mind, that's an example of a hollow victory. It's what I was saying in my presentation. That's China overshooting, because China will say, well, look, now we have strategic depth. Now we have forces deployed, 1,000 miles offshore. That's pretty cool, isn't it? We've got greater protection. I say, yeah, that part is cool for you as far as you describe it. But by the way, all you've done is cause instability with your neighbors. And true peace with your neighbors comes when they're stable and they're comfortable as well. And if you create insecurity among them, you hurt yourself. So I don't think you caused any net benefit for yourself by this kind of forced projection in the South China Sea. But I think it's very difficult for anybody. It's very difficult for China to show restraint or show that kind of judgment. So they're doing it now. The question in front of us is, are they going to do the same thing in Taiwan? They did it successfully in South China Sea, pulled it off. They sure did it successfully in Hong Kong, pulled that off. It's got to be tempting to look at Taiwan. I would say we need to make sure that our level of connectivity with Taiwan, with exercises, arms sales, training, and so forth, is high enough. And we need to make sure that the right kind of messages are going to Beijing. And they can be direct messages that we communicate something, or it can be indirect messages that we're doing something with Taiwan and Beijing picks it up. And I talked to a few friends in the administration in the last few weeks because of these Taiwan air defense zone overflights. And I say, look, these numbers are going up, whether they're probing or pushing or just who knows what the Chinese intention is. But to my mind, you need to attach a cost to that behavior. If you don't like something, you attach a cost to it, right? And if you don't attach a cost to it, you're offering perverse incentives, right? And back to my overshooting point, if China does something that we don't like and gets away with it, it is almost impossible in that system for someone to say, well, let's not do it anymore. In fact, they do something we don't like, they get away with it, they got to say, well, let's keep doing it, or let's do more of it, right? So my advice to people in the administration was, look, you've got to calibrate this in a thoughtful fashion because you're not trying to escalate, but you've got to do something that sends a signal to Beijing that this is not cost-free. And in fact, you might find yourself worse off in your terms of your security if you go with some mischievous initiatives toward Taiwan. By the way, I don't have any basis for this at my own interpretation, but my prediction is this is why all these leaks came out in the last few weeks that the U.S. is training troops in Taiwan. So we've been doing this for years, apparently, but it all just sort of came to the surface in the last few weeks. But to my mind, that was an orchestrated leak to Beijing to say, you know what? You think it's a paper tiger? You think these guys are weak? but they're actually much more integrated into the U.S. defense system than you might think, and our ability to connect with them and resupply them and work with them is much greater than you might think. So and the more you do this kind of nonsense, the more you're incentivizing us, the United States, to do more with these guys, right? So to my mind, that's a constructive message.
Well, that's really helpful. I think that outlines a lot of the challenges to our relationship with the one China, two policies, basically. So this leads into one of the questions that came in a bit earlier from Jeanette Graff. She wants to learn a little bit more about the hypersonic missiles that China has been developing, and I'll say as well as the US and Russia. What does that do to our relationship, and particularly how it fits in with Taiwan there?
Yeah, look, China takes security seriously. It takes defense spending seriously. It takes technology seriously. And it behooves the United States to do all of this as well. And you're going to see examples like this in the years and decades ahead, meaning you'll see them 8 years from now roll out a new jet fighter that they say has greater capabilities in certain respect than U.S. jet fighters, or greater stealth than U.S. So you were going to see this. It's not, I think, a full-blown arms race the way the Cold War was, but there are elements of that. All I could say is to the Americans, don't take your foot off the gas pedal. That our security is in part because of our leadership in technology, in space, in cyber warfare, and a lot of other places, and it pays to maintain that leadership. So don't discount what adversaries can do. And it's easy to see weaknesses in their system, and they've got plenty of weaknesses, but they can have compelling strengths as well. And they get a vote, just like we get a vote. But if they want to do something, they get a vote on where to do it and how to do it. So the point is, they're going to play to their strength, not their weaknesses. And it behooves us to make ongoing investments and upgrades in all of our systems as well. It also behooves us, this alliance management, alliance relationship is a very important part of what we do. And this is where we have an extraordinary set of strengths that China just doesn't have, meaning China is almost incapable of, cultivating friendly relationships, and its closest friends are places like North Korea or the Burmese junta, meaning it really doesn't have any friend that serves as a force multiplier for it. Whereas we do have friends. We do have friends and allies in like-minded countries. And some of these friendships stem from just joint shared concern about China's behavior. But the point is, a lot of what our military does is military diplomacy, is find ways of connecting with and working with these like-minded countries. And there's a huge payoff for us. I mentioned in my remarks, that was what World War II was all about. That was Cold War leadership was all about. So we're kind of a version of that right now.
Okay, so I want to come back to the alliances in a little bit, but first, George asks, we see China and Russia coming together militarily. Do you believe this is a move to counter the U.S. pivot to Asia, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, we do see that. Look, it's episodic. I write it off as expediency. There's not really a convergence of interest between these two countries. They don't have a shared worldview. There's not mutual respect. So I think the idea of an alliance or working together is a bit of a stretch. What they do have is disdain for a United States-led international order. What they do have is a delight to wrong foot the United States. So Putin would like nothing better than to have NATO deteriorate and NATO become less effective, and NATO forces in the Black Sea to be reduced, or NATO support for Ukraine to be reduced. So Putin would welcome that, and the United States and China would like nothing better than to have the United States play less of a role in East Asia. So they're joint in their antipathy, but that's very different than saying they actually have a broad worldview in common, or there's a prospect for an alliance. So nonetheless, I'd say this. I think much of our problems with Russia have to do with Putin himself. And he's not young. At some point, there's a transition. and I'm a little bit optimistic, regardless of how good or bad relations are, there's a prospect for improving relations with Russia when Putin leaves the scene. I'd also say this to a lesser extent in China, that at least some of our problems, I believe, come from Xi Jinping, who views himself more as a historical figure and as more of sort of an impetus to push issues. What happened in other communist societies is when you got through the revolutionary generation, when that happened in Russia, you moved to more of a bureaucratic government that was a more cautious or more concerned. They were still a challenge for the United States, but they were less of a challenge than under Stalin. So I think that there's a prospect for evolution in China, but it has to be post Xi Jinping.
Well, and that brings up a good question, I think, in that is Xi this monumental figure that he believes himself to be? Is he going to be spoken in the same way as Mao Zedong and all of these other sort of well-known Chinese leaders, or will there be a reckoning to come after he either steps away, passes away, however he leaves power?
Yeah, this is back to a comment I made earlier of insularity. Xi Jinping's entire life has been spent within the Communist Party. He's never worked any place, he's never lived any place except in China in the Communist Party. So that's his worldview, that's his church. And you go to somebody like that and you say, in order for China to solve the problems it faces, do you need a stronger Communist Party or a weaker Communist Party? Well, there's only one answer to that question, right? I mean, that's all he knows. I was talking with a Soviet expert, American, who's a Soviet expert, who's been on the NSC staff with me. And I said, it was amazing. Deng Xiaoping is amazing because there was nobody in the history of the Soviet Union who stood up and said, by the way, as an economic phenomenon, communism just isn't working. But it was clear as day it wasn't working. I mean, this is not a country of stupid people, but everybody could see it wasn't working. It impoverished the whole nation. And why could nobody say that? And it makes Deng Xiaoping all the more impressive that he could stand up and say, communism isn't working. But Xi Jinping is sort of a reversion to traditional communist leadership to say, what we need to do is have a better communist party, anti-corruption, no more of these financial deals where people are making money on the side or whatever. So we're going to be a true, pure communist party, and that's going to help China out. I think that's a really unfortunate recipe, and I would not be surprised if when he leaves the scene, there's a little bit of reversion back to sort of more of the Deng Xiaoping view of, for example, something that happened in China before Xi Jinping was the emergence of some degree of civic society, meaning unlike the Soviet Union, you could have institutions and organizations outside the Communist Party. Now, these might be very simple things like a book club or a basketball league, but the point is it was okay to exist and have relationships and activities that were not under the jurisdiction of the Communist Party. And that was viewed to be a healthy step ahead. Well, I think everybody on this call would agree with that. Of course, let people live their lives as they choose to live it, right? Even if you're in some kind of a dictatorship. And Xi Jinping backed out of all of that and said, no, all of this is unhealthy. So, it's a real step backwards for the country. So he views himself as sort of an ultra-Orthodox historical figure who is correcting some recent errors in the system. And I think that view is very much to China's detriment, but so be it.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions, but Luis would like to know, are we on the same page with our allies about China? It seems some European nations don't want to push back in the same way. Can you talk a little bit about why that may be?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And by the way, we saw elements of this in the Cold War with the Soviets, meaning only the United States can make a difference through force, right? So the U.S. is the indispensable nation. So it behooves, talk about the Soviets for a minute. It behooves all of our allies, let's say they're all good guys, they're all friends. We're all trying to do the same thing about the Soviets, but not one of them would ever want to be more anti-Soviet than the United States because they're not going to make a difference anyhow. So all of them have to pace their behavior against our behavior. Then some people say, you get elements of the free rider syndrome. People say, well, if the United States is doing all this work and all this lifting anyhow, I'm not really making much of a difference anyhow. I can do less anyhow, right? So you have this temptation, this budgetary pressure, and this temptation over time to do less. Well, you have somewhat that same dynamic vis-a-vis China. I think our allies in general share the concerns, and certainly the closer you are to the issue, in other words, the countries of East Asia and South Asia very much share these concerns. Europe is a little more distant; they have a little more flexibility. But you will hear from Europeans saying, "Look, is this really the fight we should lead? The United States has got to set the pace for this discussion anyhow. We'll be part of it. We'll work with it, but we're not necessarily going to lead on that." And Europe will also look very strongly at the economic dimensions of this. It's a major trading partner. Well, all I could say, again, I would hope that Biden or Trump would say, why don't we have what has been talked about for 20 years? Why don't we have a U.S.-EU free trade agreement? Why don't we make the U.S. that much more receptive to Europe and make Europe that much more receptive to the United States? And at the margin, at the least, you'll be thinking a little bit less about China and more about transatlantic trade.
Yeah, I forget the exact percentage, but certainly the U.S. and Europe and our allies make up a much larger proportion of the global economy than China does on its own. So if we could get people to come together and
yeah. Well, as I said, one of the great strengths we've got is we've got friendships and we've got relationships, but in political life, as in social life, friendship is a latent phenomenon. You've got to activate it. So to say, well, we're friends with Germany, yeah, we are friends with Germany. It's a very good relation with Germany. We don't have a free trade agreement with Germany. So we better take certain steps to embellish that friendship, to codify that in a way that makes it easy as possible for German companies and investors and consumers to connect with America. And again, just makes China that much less important. And sorry, this is my old job at the Commerce Department. Let me make a comment about standards as well. You're absolutely right that U.S. is about 25% of global GDP. EU, if you throw UK into it, it's 35%, depending if UK's in it or not. That's a big chunk of the world. If you get US, EU collaboration on automobile standards for anti-pollution or telemetrics or collision avoidance systems or airbags or tire safety standards, once you get that established, that's such a big chunk of the global market that everybody else kind of plugs into it, right? Everybody else says, if that's the standard, that's the standard. But if you have divergence between U.S. and China, then anybody else's standard is just as good as well. So the point is, let's harness our strength. Let's work with partners. Let's establish these kind of global standards that the world will tend to follow.
Yeah, I hope that we can move in that direction. Okay, we have just time, I think, to sneak in one more.
Okay.
It's kind of a big one, but I think it's important. Tom would like to know, what is your view on where the Chinese economy heads from here? There are serious headwinds, outlines a few there. Can they continue to deliver on double-digit growth, and do they need to?
Yeah, that's a super question. I don't want to put these in terms of good news and bad news. It sounds I'm a little malevolent. I mean, I hope China. I wish prosperity for China, but I hope they can enter the family of nations on the same terms as other nations and behave in the same way. And I hope they can adjust their political system to allow some kind of participation and some kind of accountability, like other leading nations have done. But I think all of these headwinds do come to the forefront. But I think they've got. I think a 20-year ride before they're so overwhelming. I think population bust is a huge, huge problem. I spent some time studying that. But again, it takes you 20 or so years of a population where the birth rate is not at the replacement rate before it shows up and it affects the economy. Because there's offsetting factors in the near term. And the offsetting factors are this. There's such improvement in human factor productivity in education. So, I mean, to put it simply, if you go back 30 years and you say what percent of Chinese population are high school graduates, pretty small. And you ask that question today, And the answer is going to be anybody who's high school age can get to high school. So you get this huge increase in economic productivity just by getting everybody to high school, right? So that offsets things like aging population or smaller workforce. And Tim mentioned manufacturing. China's losing manufacturing jobs. China's manufacturing workforce is shrinking, and companies moving offshore. But again, you say that's okay because there's so much improvement in output of what's left that the manufacturing production is still higher than it was, even though the employment is lower, right? But the point is, you can only do that once. You put everybody through high school, you can only do that once. You can't put everybody through college. You can certainly get college rates up. You'll get some improvement in productivity, getting people through college, making them more available. But again, that's not repetitive either, right? So they're gonna have the problems of mature economies have. So I'd say they've got 20 years or so that all of these problems, these headwinds, are not going to be readily apparent. That the economy is growing nicely, the middle class is there. They've got one other interesting phenomenon. I spent not since COVID, but my business is in Shanghai. So I spent most of the last 10 years go to Shanghai about 1 week a month for about 10 years. So, you talk to folks. But what's really interesting is this very vivid reminder they're one generation out of poverty. And so for the first time in people's lives, they have creature comforts that we would consider sort of everyday comforts. For the first time in somebody's life, they own a car. First time in somebody's life, they buy a pair of Nikes. First time in somebody's life, they buy a bottle of wine. First time in somebody's life, they go to a movie theater, right? I mean, this is the first time they have disposable income. So you'll run into a lot of people who will say, my dad worked in the field. My dad made $400 a month as a farmer, or he worked in the shoe factory, and he made $600 a month in the shoe factory. And I'm working for Ernst & Young, and I'm making $80,000 a year. Life is good. And the guy will tell you, hey, have you ever been to the Cannes Film Festival? I said, no, I've never been to Cannes. God, I was there 2 weeks ago. It's incredible. You really ought to go to the Cannes. So this guy's more traveled, having a better life than I'm having. So, like the point is, you can only do that once. You can only pull the rabbit out of the hat once, meaning once you get to a level of material comfort and satisfaction, people get restless. I wrote an essay recently. When does China go from the 1950s to the 1960s? The U.S. had this incredible economic boom in the 1950s, and it was a post-war recovery, and it was this extraordinary growth in the U.S. economy over that decade. But in a way that laid the groundwork for some of the turmoil of the 1960s, because once you've made it, you feel a little more empowered to offer your opinions and your complaints and so forth. So I do see this for China, but I don't see it for about 20 years or so.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your wonderful insights. We really appreciate you giving us your time and answering so many questions on quite a range of topics. As we discussed at the beginning, this certainly is not the end of our conversations on China. Having said that, I would like to thank everyone for watching, whether it's live or the recording of this. We really appreciate your interest and your support. For those of you who are interested in our next event, we have our Fall Forum fundraiser coming up on November 2nd. It will be our first hybrid event. So there will be in-person as well as online opportunities to participate. The event will be recorded, so if you're not able to watch live, you'll be able to watch afterwards. But we're really excited to host Diane Foley of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation and Carlos Martinez de la Serna of the Committee to Protect Journalists. They'll be talking about the importance of free press and the challenges that many journalists face to doing their jobs on a daily basis. We hope that you can join us for that, as well as our other future upcoming events. And we hope you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. Have a wonderful evening.